The bloodshed that took place during the 1990s in the area of former Yugoslavia was interpreted in various ways by different quasi-theoreticians. Most of these interpretations kept falling into the chasm of sensationalist spectacle and intrigue, focusing on the conquests, war crimes, genocides, and unresolved hostilities which haunt us up to this day. This superficial and irresponsible approach has turned our corner of the world into a mythical gladiator arena, the perfect flashy shitshow and epicenter of political intrigue, that entertains the rest of the world with its proud labels as the powder keg of Europe and the land of blood and honey. In their liberally naive, calculated, and superstitious attempts to explain the collapse of socialism and ravaging war of the 90s, it was given prefixes such as ethnic, religious, civil, and in some cases even tribal. Armed with such rhetorical ammunition and constant reminders of fratricidal bloodshed and genocide, this approach aims to prove how multi-ethnic and socialist states like Yugoslavia are doomed to end up badly and eventually succumb to the notorious Balkan curse. The inescapable vortex of hatred, hostility, division, and conflict, supposedly specific to this corner of the world. Therefore, this documentary seeks to refute this very superstition and offer a more profound and nuanced outlook on the turbulent history of the Balkan Peninsula, a perspective that goes beyond the usual chauvinist arrogance, nationalistic mythology, superstitious metaphysics, and back-and-forth accusations which dominate modern historical discourse. We will seek to understand the root causes and historical dynamics of the most recent wave of chaos that shook the Balkans and has been keeping this region decades behind the rest of Europe. To do so, we'll have to take a closer look at the historical developments of this region in a wider socioeconomic context. We'll examine and demystify well-known and notorious eras and paradigms, while ignoring specific dates and categorizations which wrongfully turn history into a checkbox of linear events and isolated spectacles, which tell us absolutely nothing about the how and why of our current predicament. Instead, we'll view history as a fluid, dynamic, and ever-changing stream of socioeconomic antagonisms and conflicts, processes that occur below the surface, beyond the visible spectrum of great wars and political intrigue, and are able to give these developments proper context and meaning within the flow of history. So, without further ado, let us begin. Everyone who's had the opportunity to travel through the countries that originally count as Balkan, namely the ex-Yugoslav republics, Bulgaria, the eastern part of Turkey, Albania, and Greece, can testify that what we have there is a differentiated region with a relatively similar cultural heritage, people, and customs. On the other hand, this relatively unique geographical landscape is simultaneously sharply intersected with a bunch of artificially tailored state borders, religions, and local nationalisms. Well, there is a very good reason for this absurdly complex mosaic of nation-states at the periphery of the old continent. This region in the southeast of Europe, similar in surface area to Germany or Spain, has had a completely different historical development compared to developed Western nations. It never managed to form a unified national market, despite all economical logic. Europe had started rapidly changing in the 18th and 19th centuries, with the arrival of a fresh new social class onto the scene, the bourgeoisie, which in that time played a progressive role of dismantling obsolete medieval borders and formation of modern nation-states. The Balkans, however, have met this historical stage stuck between the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, two bastions of reaction that resisted the revolutionary wave and tightly held the area of southeastern Europe under their feudal yoke. This tight and bloody grip of the two competing empires, which had lasted for many centuries, has had profound consequences on the social, cultural, and economic development and ethnogenesis of Balkan peoples, which will become more apparent later on in this documentary. Nonetheless, at the beginning of the 19th century, with the announcement of the ultimate decline of the Ottoman Empire, the first attempts at establishing independent national states in the Balkans had begun. The local bourgeoisie was, compared to their Western idols, made up of a weak layer of small merchants, organically tied to the feudal oligarchy and entirely dependent on the support of imperialist powers from both the east and west. With the decline of the Ottoman Empire, it was Tsarist Russia that positioned itself as the soulmate and quote-unquote protector of Slavic brothers. On the other hand, Austria-Hungary conducted its colonization under the veneer of enlightenment and liberation from Turkish backwardness. In his manuscripts, as a reporter for the Balkans, Leon Trotsky described the deceptive politics of the Habsburgs in particular in the following manner. Austrian policy in the Balkans organically combines capitalist predation, bureaucratic ruthlessness, and dynastical intrigue. The gendarme, the financier, the Catholic priest, and agent provocateur share this very task. All of this combined is labeled as the accomplishment of a quote-unquote cultural mission. The Balkan Wars, where the young and bold Balkan mini-states stood side by side while expelling the Ottomans to the south, were at the same time a late fight for national liberation and formation of viable nation-states, but also mini-imperialist wars of conquest, where the voracious national ruling classes, under the patronage of great imperialist powers, grabbed small chunks of territories and peoples that Turkey left behind. The main actors in this conquest were Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, which acted as vultures while each grabbing a small portion of the former Ottoman Empire in an attempt of gaining sea access. In these wars, Serbia quote-unquote regained the area of so-called Old Serbia, including Kosovo, and pierced into North and Central Macedonia, while the Montenegrin army entered Sanjak and approached Albania. As they had finished their business with the Turks, the Serbian and Bulgarian bourgeoisie began their personal conflict. All of this constant movement of borders was accomplished with so-called ethnic cleansing, conducted by the respective national armies in an attempt of establishing ethnically differentiated borders. However, within the European context, this local bourgeoisie was still a collection of minions. The imperialist powers consciously used Balkan nations as pawns for the repression of the Ottomans, dosing their territorial expansion accordingly. Whenever they felt that one of them could potentially become a local power, they would cut their aspirations at the root, while tailoring borders according to their own will. For example, Albania was therefore given sovereignty at the London Conference as a means of preventing Serbia's expansion towards the Adriatic coast. So, in the midst of these flashy surface-level events, widely known as the Balkan Wars, the socio-economic process of forming nation-states was going on in the background. Hereby, guided by historical materialism, we shouldn't view the nation as the quote-unquote eternal spirit of a certain group of people. Had Knez Lazar shouted "Serbs to glory" on the Kosovo field in 1389, the cavalrymen gathered around the honorary cross would have looked at each other in utter confusion. The nation is a historical category and heritage of bourgeois revolutions and the formation of nation-states. While opposing metaphysical interpretations, we understand that what melts different peoples into one nation with a common language and cultural heritage is life under a unique capitalist economic formation. It's the same case with the oppressed peoples in Asia and Africa that were compressed into one state under imperialist occupation. Therefore, a multitude of occupiers, a non-existent central market, the fragmentation of territories, and constant movement of borders have prevented the same process from happening on the level of the Balkans, and have therefore created preconditions for fragmentation, economic backwardness, and an ethnic slaughterhouse that this region inevitably turned into. Similarly to the Middle East, Balkan states and borders are artificial creations, tailored in smoky conference rooms of imperial powers that divided these populations in an unnatural way. The Balkans have been and always stayed a semi-colony within Europe. For example, following the retreat of Turkey, the economic policy of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was consciously directed at the prevention of the development of an independent industrial base in the neighboring Balkan countries. Very favorable tariffs for export of agricultural products and livestock have in turn tied the economies of these nations with its western neighbor, and have made them dependent on finished industrial products from Austria. Unfavorable exchange and concession relations over local natural resources, allowed by the obedient Balkan ruling classes, have turned this region into an economic cripple that was decades behind the rest of Europe. At the beginning of the previous century, the entire region participated in only 2.5% of the entire industrial highway of Europe. Most of the industry that did exist was tied to basic processing of agricultural products and was concentrated in the northern regions. Thus, 80% of the population was made up of peasants, tied in feudal relations with kulaks. Therefore, through a mixture of external sabotage and domestic corruption, it can be concluded that the responsibility for this idiosyncratic path of development lies equally by the ruthlessness of the exploitative imperial core and the obedience of the peripheral domestic elites that made these conspiracies possible, for their own personal benefit and at the detriment of the entire population of peasants and workers who fought their wars and polished their crowns, while drowning in their own blood. Stuck between these currents of foreign meddling and domestic betrayal by those same reactionary forces that allegedly seek to empower the said nation, Balkan peoples have marched through this era of history in a crippled, oppressed, and overexploited state, unable to achieve their full potential due to forces and paradigms which were completely out of their control. Paradigms which will haunt them to this very day. So, looking back at the previous era, we can observe that centuries of subordination and isolation have left the peoples of the Balkan Peninsula behind the rest of Europe, economically and socially, scattered and estranged from one another. The historical processes that had consolidated Western European peoples into clearly defined nation-states had run into a set of peculiar difficulties when it came to uniting this specific geographical area. The legacy of the Byzantine, Ottoman, and Austro-Hungarian empires and their hegemonic rule had left behind a mosaic of religions, customs, dialects, and cultures that had arisen out of the common South Slavic ancestry. People groups that are in essence no more different than the initial Germanic groups brought together under one roof by Prussia, or the various regional Italian dialects and cultures united by Piedmont, or, in the case of the South Slavs, plagued with much deeper antagonisms that prevail up to this day. Partially owing to the fact that the various South Slavic ethnicities were more or less isolated from each other and had very little contact with their brothers in the neighboring empire, which explains the visibly different cultural development of Croats and Slovenes opposed to, for example, Serbs and Bosniaks. Nonetheless, the economic logic of capitalist development had directed the ruling classes of the tiny Balkan states into the creation of a wider unified market that would break this prevailing backwardness and initiate progress. This tendency, manifested in the attempts of creating a Greater Bulgaria or Greater Serbia, has had bloody clashes and the strengthening of local chauvinisms as a dire consequence. On the other hand, Pan-Slavism, as an idea that would unite the different Slavic peoples that inhabited the Balkans, as noble as it may sound, was in reality only a curtain behind which rested the ugly face of Tsarist Russia and the Serbian ruling elite, who sought to expand their political influence into the political vacuum that Austria-Hungary was to leave behind. This doctrine was fueled by rising Serbian nationalism that was primarily advocated for the unification of quote-unquote all Serbian lands, since, according to the leader of the radical party Nikola Pasic, cut off from other Serbian lands, Serbia has no reason to exist. The quasi-revolutionary organization, Unification or Death, better known as the Black Hand, was the instrument that, under the patronage of Tsarist Russia, sought to follow this agenda to the grave. This war psychosis was only supplemented by the Austrian annexation of Bosnia in 1908, and political provocations and pressures of 1914 that plunged Serbia into a war against the Austrian hegemon that ended up engulfing the entire continent. Officially, the government of the Kingdom of Serbia assigned itself the role of Piedmont from the unification of Italy. They were to be the instigators of the unification of all South Slavic peoples on this wider geographical space that had been under foreign hegemony for centuries, as was explicitly proclaimed in the Niš Declaration of 1914, whereby the fight for the liberation of Serbia in the Great War was equated with the liberation of all Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, with the Yugoslav Council as an official bearer of this idea, founded in London in October of 1915. The post-war question of constructing this common state in an egalitarian manner, concerning all of its peoples, was passionately and violently debated between the ruling classes of the two most populous ethnic groups, the Serbs and Croats, with the Serbian elites advocating for a centralized and the Croats for a more federalized model, preferably with a pre-established Croatian nation-state that would be then a part of a wider Yugoslav federation. The federal model itself included various proposals, including a so-called dual monarchy, whereas the Yugoslav Council had no unanimous stance or solution whatsoever. The different perceptions of the two political and intellectual camps had caused rifts that would become insurmountable, as the Croatian intelligentsia and reactionary elements struggled against the soon-to-be ruling Serbian Karađorđević dynasty that imposed its cultural and political hegemony while poetically and formally advocating for pan-Slavic brotherhood. At the eve of the Great War, the meddling of varying imperialist powers was reflected in the instability of state structures. With the recurring coups, dynastical shifts, assassinations, etc., the Balkans had become the world epicenter of intrigue, and a place where, up to this day, most political disturbances are explained away with conspiracy theories. The First World War had once again caught Balkan peoples on the opposite sides of barricades. Bulgaria pledged their allegiance to the Central Powers in an attempt to regain territories that were taken away from them with the peace conferences after the Balkan Wars, whereas Serbia aligned itself on the side of the Entente, exiting the war as a quote-unquote winner with a very tragic balance sheet. With the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the question was raised about the future of the newly liberated peoples that emerged from underneath the Habsburg curtains. As a quote-unquote reward for sacrificing its own population, the Serbian ruling class was awarded the role of being the policeman over the new Frankenstein creation of global imperialism, Yugoslavia. In an attempt to somehow resolve the national question, the victorious Allied powers decided to create a new nation in the middle of the Balkans. Naturally, this wasn't possible with a decree from above, and the newly established state didn't manage to resolve the burning national question, nor was it able to rescue the region from medieval backwardness. The Serbian bourgeoisie had shown itself to be incapable of upgrading the productive forces and uniting the various people groups that inhabited the area, which would fulfill the historical task that was given to it, to be fair, somewhat too late. The then existing Yugoslavia rightfully wore the label prison cell of peoples. In the period of economic crisis and with a weak initial basis, the perspectives of the development of a modern bourgeois parliamentary democracy were rather slim. The Serbian monarchy was forced to rule in an authoritarian manner, banning political parties and preventing the different people groups from freely expressing themselves. In such an atmosphere, the increased resistance of the Croatian and Slovenian bourgeoisie was inevitable, that leaned onto the peasant masses in these northern republics to develop chauvinist tendencies, in an attempt to resist authority from Belgrade. The remilitarization and renewed imperialist ambitions of the German ruling class, in the form of Nazism in the 30s, only worsened the situation and sealed the fate of the monarcho-capitalist Yugoslavia once and for all. In the end, the tragic fate of the first Yugoslav experiment can be traced back to two intermediate causes whose combination led to its inevitable demise: uneven socioeconomic development and dictatorial rule. Namely, the economic development of the Yugoslav territories was extremely uneven. The northern republics possessed a far more developed productive base as a heritage from Austria-Hungary, whereas the areas of Bosnia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and Vardar Macedonia were stuck in archaic conditions inherited from the Ottomans. These social and economic contradictions were reflected in the political antagonisms and sterility of the Yugoslav parliament, which could only be tamed with an autocratic and dictatorial mandate. So, under the dictate from Belgrade, the official hegemon of the Frankenstein creation, The well-established Croatian and Slovenian bourgeoisie was increasingly pressured, sabotaged, and ultimately alienated to the point of total collapse, with the peasant and proletarian population, as always, bearing the brunt of the upcoming conflict that would come to scar the South Slavic tribes, seemingly beyond repair. The Second World War had thrown Yugoslavia into a frenzy of shocking events and an unforgiving chaos that wounded the region for decades to come. The local bourgeoisie had shown itself incapable and unready to defend the territories they ruled over against the attack of the Nazi troops. A portion of the ruling class, together with the royal family, packed their luggage and ran away to countries that awaited them with bank accounts, while the most reactionary section of the ruling class, with their own goals and ambitions, greeted their moment of fame by subjecting themselves to the service of the occupier. The Yugoslav army was decimated, and the occupation was finalized in just 11 days. Parts of the ruling class of each nationality formed their military units that subject themselves under direct or indirect command of the occupying army, thus once again igniting the flame of ethnic cleansing. Having seen that the project of civil Yugoslavia was nothing short of a disaster, the local bourgeoisie attempts to establish their little nation-states under the occupying forces. Under the patronage of German and Italian fascists, the marionette regime of the Ustaše had entrenched itself as the new ruling elite, beginning the genocide against the Jews, Roma, Serbs, and Croatian communists. In Serbia, the government of Milan Nedić and the military formations of Dimitrije Ljotić provide aid for the Nazis and participate in genocide under the excuse of quote-unquote saving the nation, while a portion of the officer caste decides to form a separate movement, the so-called Ravnogorski Pokret, that was allegedly supposed to be the armed representative of the quote-unquote anti-fascist wing of the Serbian bourgeoisie, the monarchy, and Serbian government in exile in London. Other nationalities also see the rise of their own armed pro-fascist formations, such as the Muslim militia in Bosnia and the National Front in Kosovo. The only authentic alternative to this madness was personified by the partisan movement under the leadership of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. The workers' movement has had deep roots in the Balkans. Besides the majority peasant population, the young working class that had been developing within the cities started forming their social democratic parties with the turn of the century, while following progressive currents of the West. The October Revolution of Russia had sent a strong echo among the workers, the youth, and peasant masses of the Balkans. The rapid economic progress between two world wars, the agrarian reform, and extensive societal and cultural progress of the Soviet Union, despite the harmful excesses of Stalin's rule, had promoted the prospect of a planned economy as an attractive alternative to capitalist depression and a solution to overcome feudal backwardness. After the First World War, the Communist Party had experienced a rapid increase in membership. In 1920, the party counted 60,000 members and won third place in the elections with 12% of the votes. However, in the period of oppression that followed, the party was forced to function illegally. Her members were persecuted, her leadership incarcerated, executed, or in exile. However, it wasn't only the pressure of the Yugoslav ruling class that was impacting the face of the party. The strengthening of the privileged bureaucratic layer in Moscow during the 20s and 30s, personified in Joseph Stalin, had turned the Third International and all of its sections into obedient followers of orders. There was no clear party line. Due to a plethora of highly controversial and questionable developments, instead of promoting workers' revolutions in all nations, the national parties served for manipulation in accordance with the interests of the foreign policy of the Stalinist bureaucracy and the agenda of constructing socialism in one country, the Soviet Union. The Yugoslav Party couldn't avoid this process of political degeneration either, with recurring purges and the loss of internal democracy. In 1937, under the dictate from Moscow, the entire Central Committee of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was purged. Josip Broz himself came to prominence in the midst of one such Stalinist purge, after the assassination of former leader Milan Gorkic. Nonetheless, despite everything, the party managed to maintain its cadres and well-developed underground network and confront the occupation with some 12,000 young communists organized within the SKOJ, the League of Communist Youth of Yugoslavia. Armed forces were organized quickly after the invasion. However, despite the high morale of their members, open conflict was postponed for the time being. Moscow had assigned Tito and the partisans the role of a small guerrilla force with the goal of disrupting the fascist army in its advances, not to conduct its own national liberation, let alone revolution. Stalin was still under the non-aggression pact with Hitler and was seeking to avoid the unavoidable, a German attack. Only after the invasion against the Soviet Union did Stalin give the green light for the launching of an open conflict. But what kind of confrontation was this supposed to be? Well, in accordance with the then current orientation of the Communist International, the policy of People's National Front, aka the support and mutual action with progressive sections of the bourgeoisie, was promoted. What did such a policy mean concretely on the example of Yugoslavia? Well, the partisans were supposed to fight alongside the Chetnik formations of Draža Mihailović and mutually conduct the fight for national liberation. In this context, national liberation meant the expulsion of the occupiers, without any concrete change in the socio-economic relations of the country. During the entirety of the war, Moscow officially recognized the exiled government in London and the Crown as the legitimate representatives of the Yugoslav people. Shockingly enough, Radio Moscow was assigning all partisan endeavors and successes to the Chetniks, in accordance with the orientation of the Allies, who recognized the Chetniks as the official anti-fascist movement in Yugoslavia. The Soviet Union has denied material support to the partisans up until 1944. Global imperialism, the Soviet bureaucracy, and the very top of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia had an unofficial agreement. After the liberation, the royal suite was to return to the country and continue business as usual, while Moscow and Tito would be completely satisfied with the prospects of strengthening influence of the Communist Party within the confines of the Yugoslav bourgeois parliament. However, everyone seemed to be overseeing the most relevant player in the equation, the Yugoslav masses. The partisan movement had shown itself to be extremely popular. By advocating for national equality and exploiting the ever-expanding principle of anti-fascism, the partisan movement acted like a magnet that attracted the peasantry and especially the youth. By the end of 1942, the partisan army counted 150,000 people. Only 1 year later, this number had doubled, and by the end of the war, the number of armed people was 800,000. The partisans had evolved into a massive social movement. Hundreds of thousands of disenfranchised after decades of dictatorship had finally gotten the impression that they can change something with their own hands. With such pressure from below, the political line of the party leadership inevitably started to change. With small steps, the fight for national liberation had overgrown into a full-on social revolution. Being able to lean onto the massive movement behind its back, party leadership starts feeling confident enough to distance itself from the dictate from Moscow. In accordance with the general orientation of the United Front, instead of forming workers' and peasant soviets as the new organs of rule, according to class criteria, the party started forming so-called anti-fascist committees in the liberated territories, that even included members of pre-war bourgeois parties. However, it turned out that Tito was looking for non-existent phantom allies in the form of a quote-unquote progressive bourgeoisie that would be ready to conduct a decisive struggle against the occupation. Those who had accounts in foreign banks had run away a long time ago, whereas those who stayed were largely leaning on the German army that, regardless of its oppressive nature, still guaranteed their old property rights in the country, opposed to the communist guerrilla. The Anti-Fascist Committee for the Liberation of Yugoslavia had thus, while remaining within a vacuum, without any real participation of the bourgeoisie in the perilous structures that were developing, had a clear path to dispose of the medieval relicts within only a few months and succeeded in what the bourgeoisie hadn't managed to do with parliamentary democracy in decades. In November of 1943, Yugoslavia was officially declared a republic. During this period, within the liberated territories, the property of the collaborators with the occupier was nationalized, which essentially meant the expropriation of local capitalists and kulaks. Factories were put under the control of workers' committees that begin with the arms production for the fronts. Women start engaging in the political life of the country in massive numbers, while also fighting in battles. Very first schools are formed for the largely illiterate population. A post and railway network are established in the liberated territories. National minorities are for the first time able to engage in political discourse on equal terms. It turned out that the only method of effectively fighting the fascists was mass participation of the masses, and their mobilization was dependent on a wide range of social reforms. Contrary to popular opinion, Moscow did not view these endeavors of Tito and the partisans in a good light. Stalin wanted to maintain the coalition with Britain and the US and convinced them that he had no intention of expanding the socialist revolution beyond Russia. In a letter to Tito in 1942, the Comintern wrote the following: "Why did you form, for instance, a separate proletarian brigade? In the present moment, the main objective is the unification of all anti-fascist tendencies." This tactic of Moscow turned out to be a debacle in practice and a sure path towards ruin. Cooperation with the Chetniks had shown itself to be impossible. As early as November 1941, the Chetniks were organizing armed operation against the partisans. General Mihailovich had overestimated the readiness of the Serbian bourgeoisie to confront Germany. With a lack of a layer of Yugoslav society that they could lean onto, the Chetniks were deemed to fail. The only thing the Chetniks could count on was the idiocy and backwardness of the Serbian peasant housekeeper, and maybe a thin layer of kulaks. However, with the wide social movement that had enveloped the countryside, this was a very thin base. Already by 1943, most Chetnik actions were directed at the elimination of the partisans and the ethnic cleansing of the non-Serbian population in mixed areas. Divided into several fractions with no central structure, the Chetniks had fallen into such degeneration that the global bourgeoisie was forced to abandon them and start supporting the only army that had effectively fought the fascists. To this day, this fact is a painful reminder for the right wing of the Serbian bourgeoisie, whose ideologues interpret this move through various conspiracy theories. The truth, however, is much simpler. Confronted with the encroachment of fascism, imperialism had abandoned its Serbian quote-unquote brothers, as they had become completely useless, and it had pragmatically started supporting their natural enemies. The partisans had become a force that could not be ignored. Despite the Stalinist leadership, they were the most progressive phenomenon ever born in this region and are part of the heritage of the global workers' movement. For the first time in history, in the middle of the Balkans, there had arisen a movement that united all nationalities and religions and unhesitatingly carried society forward. Following the end of the war, Tito stood in front of a historical decision. In Potsdam in 1945, the agreement between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill to divide Yugoslavia 50-50 was confirmed. Still blindly following the Stalinist school of the National Front, the Communist Party pulled the sleeves of the representatives of the bourgeoisie and dragged them into the so-called Tito-Subasic government. Such a balance of powers was not possible with a forceful rush of armed workers and peasants who were encouraged by the victory over fascism, confident that the country was in their hands. Thus, the Communist Party nationalizes most industries, establishes a monopoly over foreign trade, and therefore buries capitalism in Yugoslavia. In Albania, a partisan movement similar to the Yugoslav one conducts its own revolution. In Bulgaria, the Red Army and local opposition forces take control. In Greece and Italy, massive armed communist movements are on the verge of coming to power. With the bust of local Balkan bourgeoisies, the conditions for the melting of Balkan borders and the formation of a socialist federation become increasingly ripe. This was a completely sensible and realistic option that the Yugoslav leadership was seriously taking into consideration, while conducting negotiations with Georgi Dimitrov and Enver Hoxha. However, the last thing that Moscow wanted was a series of revolutions, and the creation of a socialist federation of the Balkans, as an alternative to the Soviet Union as the quote-unquote cradle of socialism. So, with the beginning of the Cold War and the offensive of imperialism on the world stage, the Soviet Union was forced to provide a decisive answer, and ended up conducting the nationalization of property in the countries of Eastern Europe, despite not having planned it initially, thereby making them into its satellites. The Yugoslav leadership, having seen how Stalin was treating countries within his sphere of interest, decides to evacuate itself from the jaws of the Soviet Union, while leaning onto the armed masses and partially in global imperialism, thus beginning a quote-unquote independent course. However, Greece and Italy were clearly completely out of the clearly defined line that assembled the countries of Eastern Europe that were promised to Stalin in the conferences of Yalta and Potsdam. Herewith, their destiny was already sealed. Following the catastrophic advice from Moscow, the Italian communists give up their arms and surrender to the rule of the bourgeoisie, while Greek comrades initially do the same, followed by an unexpected ultra-left turnover that ends up starting an uprising. In this situation, Tito closes the border with Greece and refuses to continue aiding the pro-Soviet Greek partisans. Albania and Bulgaria, under the pressure from Moscow, seize all relations with Yugoslavia, thus forcing all communist parties in the region to start the construction of socialism in their own backyard, while antagonizing Yugoslavia's independent course as an anti-Soviet imperialist aberration. In such a highly tensed constellation of powers, Tito turns the country towards the construction of the quote-unquote Yugoslav path towards socialism, better known as workers' self-management. By keeping the revolution within the Yugoslav framework, Tito essentially makes a compromise and decides to realize a project that the bourgeoisie never managed to. The new state was supposed to be based on Yugoslavism, i.e. on the creation of a new Yugoslav nation as an alternative to ethnic hatred and division. For a long time, it seemed that Tito succeeded in this. The new Yugoslavia was a fundamentally different social formation from the previous one. The abolition of the market, the planned economy, the expropriation of private property, and the monopoly over foreign trade created the basis for the most dynamic economic progress in the history of the Balkans. However, that state was deformed at the very start, in the sense that direct workers' democracy was not established, but planning decisions were made based on the assessment of the communist bureaucracy behind closed doors. History has shown that the possibilities of economic progress on such principles are limited. Due to the impossibility of a free flow of information and decision-making, after a while, problems of inefficiency in production and allocation inevitably appear. Until the late 1970s, this framework managed to improve the productive forces in the heart of the Balkans. Despite many abuses, failed bureaucratic investments, and the lack of true workers' democracy, the socialist state of Yugoslavia achieved impressive economic growth in its first 3 decades, carried out accelerated industrialization, and achieved the fastest rate of population urbanization in history. Real progress was not embodied in mere statistical growth of the GDP, but the way in which it was distributed. The Yugoslav population enjoyed a high level of social protection, quality of education, and rights in the workplace. Planned development made it possible to pay more attention to the most underdeveloped parts of the country, such as Kosovo, Macedonia, and Montenegro, whose societies, within a few years, made a leap from feudal, patriarchal, tribal communities to the genesis of an urbanized proletariat. The scope of the socialization of the means of production and the planned economy remains clear when the former Yugoslavia is compared with the development of Balkan countries that remained imprisoned in capitalist social formations under pro-fascist regimes such as Greece or Turkey. The Communist Party enjoyed the support of the vast majority of citizens and without worrying about its position, was able to facilitate a certain level of freedom of speech and expression that was not common in Eastern Bloc countries. Cultural life flourished, freeing itself from the dogma of real socialism, and various national minorities, which throughout history did not have the opportunity for autonomous expression, such as Albanians in Kosovo, Macedonians, and Muslim Slavs in Bosnia, are given the opportunity to exercise cultural and religious autonomy. In this atmosphere of general progress, the nation as a political category loses all meaning in everyday life. Migration of workers from one republic to another and mixed marriages become the norm. In the 1981 census, about 5% of the population declared themselves as Yugoslav. The Yugoslav nation, it seemed, was firmly established as the foundation of a common state. In the initial period after the war, the privileged class was not so prominent. In the 1940s and 50s, the privileges of the party bureaucracy were not so obvious, in line with the general underdevelopment of the country. The most that a party functionary could get out of his position in the 40s and 50s was a private driver, a slightly better living space, and a vacation on the Adriatic coast. Besides, the collectivist spirit developed during the revolution was still maintained in a good part of the party long after the war. Most of the ordinary party members who carried the revolution on their shoulders abhorred any privilege and had a moral contempt for any abuse of their political position. Personal enrichment was considered shameful. However, ethical principles and morals are one thing, and material reality is another. As the productive forces developed, so did the basis for the privileges of the upper party officials. And already in the 1960s, bureaucratic pressure began to stifle the further progress of the Yugoslav economy. By preventing proper allocation and distribution based on real needs, the bureaucratic layer becomes a kind of cover that prevented healthy development with its abuses and growing privileges. At the end of the 1960s, it became clear that the road towards socialism was not so secure, and it was noticed that something was wrong. As always, students are the social stratum that first reflects the internal disturbances in society, and the student demonstrations in 1968 were the first cry against this arrangement. Slogans against the red bourgeoisie and calls for a return to true Marxism clearly reflected the population's dissatisfaction with the tendencies of stratification within their society. So now, faced with growing contradictions within the country, the ruling bureaucracy, instead of returning to the roots of Marxism and establishing workers' democracy, turned to the more attractive option of liberalizing economic life. In the absence of a clear political course, an independent position vis-à-vis the Soviet Union brings the Titoist bureaucracy closer to imperialism. Before any other Eastern European nomenclature, the Yugoslav Party established ties with imperialist financial organizations such as the IMF. Che Guevara, in his diary, while passing through Yugoslavia in the 1960s, notes how local companies are competing on the domestic market for raw materials and product marketing. Trying to suppress inefficiency, with a series of reforms during the 60s and finally with the new constitution in 1974, the liberalization of foreign trade, the labor market, and the centralized plan are carried out. All, of course, under the guise of self-management, i.e., giving greater decision-making rights to workers. The nominally existing, self-governing workers' committees at the factories were easy prey for the manipulation of the growing managerial technocracy, and liberalization provided unprecedented opportunities for corruption and personal enrichment. The decentralization of political and economic life reached such limits that each part of the now fragmented companies could freely compete for loans on foreign capital markets. IMF management was probably having nervous breakdowns trying to locate responsibility for the massive loans. In such a constellation, the rivalry between the local republican bureaucracies logically grows, which strive to become as independent as possible in negotiations with imperialist institutions, and keep as much of the Republican product as possible in their own backyard. Entering the 1980s, trade deficits and inflation began to tear apart the already strained economic relations. In an attempt to reduce the deficit and respond to external debt claims whose installments are slowly but surely beginning to arrive, the government is forced to radically reduce general spending and begins to implement IMF's first restrictive programs. Economically, the most backward republics were the first to feel the consequences of this policy. The policy of even development comes into question. The working class of Kosovo and Macedonia, and then of the other republics, is beginning to feel the reforms on their own backs. The nation as a political factor returns to the scene, and the bureaucratic apparatus, under pressure from below, begins to become more and more ruthless. In 1981, faced with mass protests by the Albanian majority in Kosovo, Belgrade purged the local authorities and ruthlessly crushed the protests in a cruel campaign unseen since Ranković's days. In Kosovo, a wave of migration begins, both Serbian and Albanian, who, faced with growing economic problems, unemployment, and political pressure, go to Serbia or Western Europe. The Belgrade bureaucracy is using the emigration of the Serbian population in a media campaign against the Albanian population, in which, avoiding recognition of the real causes of the crisis, the entire blame is placed on Albanian separatism. Additional destabilization came in the form of the death of Josip Broz Tito. For decades, Tito ruled in a classic Bonapartist style, relying at critical moments on the various classes within Yugoslav society and the various republican bureaucracies, managing to maintain a relative equilibrium. Under his absolute authority and the auspices of Yugoslavism, class conflicts and interests of the local bureaucracies were hidden and calmed down. All the conditions for the final explosion of huge contradictions, which had been building up for decades, were finally there in the 1980s. After 4 decades of relative stability, Yugoslav society is once again entering a revolutionary phase. From 1982, the standard of living began to fall precipitously, and by the end of the decade, it dropped by 40%, thus reaching the level of the mid-60s. The Yugoslav working class responded to the pressures and declining living standards with a series of strikes in the 1980s. In the first 9 months of 1987, over 1,000 strikes were organized throughout the country, involving around 150,000 workers of all nationalities. In 1989, the number of workers on strike grew to 900,000. The Yugoslav working class found itself once again at a historical turning point. Either it will make a political revolution and, breaking the parasitic bureaucratic layer, enable further development and keep all the achievements of the Yugoslav revolution, or it will be broken and dragged into mass bloodshed and capitalism. The 80s are definitely the years in which the party finally quote-unquote lost its innocence. The differences in the standard of living of the ordinary worker and the party leadership and managerial technocracy had become drastic. Over time, the aspirations of the alienated bureaucratic stratum become ever greater. The Titoist caste developed an internal culture and value system that imitated the ruling classes of Western countries. A large number of members of this layer already had well-established connections with various mentors in the West, and foreign bank accounts where they accumulated money acquired by abusing their position and privileges that the system allowed them. Bureaucracy becomes, in essence, a transmission mechanism through which world imperialism exerts pressure on the Yugoslav working class. The working class loses its illusions and leaves the Communist Party en masse, and already in 1985, it was calculated that only every 11th semi-skilled worker is a member of the party, and among qualified workers, every 5th. By 1987, only 30% of the party and 8% of the party's central committee were workers. On the other hand, about 95% of the directors and 77% of the intelligentsia were party members. Ordinary people are beginning to see the party as a place for careerists and executives, rather than a political instrument through which the masses can express themselves. The bureaucratic oligarchy, faced with general discontent, is forced to show its true colors, using the police and organizing media raids against workers and national minorities, initially mainly against the Albanian population in Kosovo. However, there were not many opportunities for organized expression outside the party. The tradition of independent trade union organizing practically did not exist since the 40s. Stalinist doctrine was terrified of any kind of worker organization independent of official state structures. The role of trade unions in Yugoslav socialism was limited to organizing cultural events, annual vacations, and sharing winter rations. Entire generations of workers grew up without any experience of union struggle. Such a naive working class, with a low degree of class consciousness, was relatively easy prey. Initially, these protests had a spontaneous and progressive character. Although the main demands remained mostly in the purely economic sphere, such as wage increases or better working conditions, the political content of the protests was almost instinctively pro-Yugoslav and anti-bureaucratic, with demands for respecting the self-governing rights of workers. Workers of all nationalities marched together under Tito's pictures and Yugoslav flags. Horrified by the movement of the masses, the bureaucratic caste in all republics had no other choice but to try and ride the waves of discontent that had already started and try to direct them to their advantage, injecting the bacillus of nationalism among the dissatisfied masses. By fabricating interethnic incidents and using media propaganda to spread chauvinism, Republican bureaucracies are decimating the movement, tearing it apart along national lines. By introducing nationalism into the equation, the ruling bureaucracies save their own heads in a pre-revolutionary situation. Suddenly, the culprits for unemployment and declining standards in Serbia are not the fat-ass members of the Union of Communists of Serbia, but the Croats and the Shqiptars. A similar scenario played out in each of the republics, where people of other nationalities always assume the role of being responsible for the problems. The Republican rulers easily got rid of Yugoslavism and started national hysteria and the abandonment of the common state, which is slowly sinking. Imperialism, of course, enthusiastically supports and encourages such tendencies in the League of Communists. Every Republican bureaucracy had a Western bourgeoisie as its guardian angel. Now, if we take away the whole spectacular theater of nationalism, charismatic leaders, religion, fugitive generals, the Vatican, ethnic cleansing, Mujahideen, Ustaše, Greater Serbia, mafia, and conspiracy theories, the breakup of Yugoslavia and the wars that followed are reduced to one basic socio-economic transformation. Collective ownership of the means of production and the planned economy simply became too narrow a framework to further satisfy the growing appetites of the bureaucratic caste. Imitating the ruling classes of developed Western countries for decades, faced with a stagnant planned economy, part of the bureaucracy decides to abandon quote-unquote ideals and become the ruling class in its own republics. Milošević, Tudjman and company were only the political representatives of this ambitious layer, their reflection at the top of the Communist Party. People who will make a political coup in their own republics, rid themselves of the burden of the old Tito cadres who still harbored illusions about Yugoslavism and mistrust of the West, and start sailing towards the promised land of capitalism. Every counter-revolution is bloody, and the Yugoslav one was no exception. The emerging ruling classes had to carry out the initial accumulation and distribution of spheres of influence by gangster methods, but above all, they had to destroy the idea of Yugoslavia. the terrible crimes committed on the territory of the former Socialist Republic are by no means a coincidence or a mere whim of monstrous minds. Blood had to be shed to destroy the last hope that a life together was possible. So today, when you ask an ordinary working man in any of the former republics what he thinks about Yugoslavia, he will answer that it is a nice but impossible idea. A large state with a planned economy in the heart of the Balkans after the collapse of the Soviet Union was a thorn in the side of imperialism. Nationalism was the perfect weapon for disintegrating it and burying all the echoes of the partisan social revolution. Yugoslavia had to be crucified. Its population had to be punished for the heresy they committed 50 years ago when they dared to abolish capitalism and try to take their destiny into their own hands. The example had to be so horrible so that all of the other peoples on the Balkans and around the world would be convinced once and for all that socialism is quote-unquote impossible. And if you think about it, we should give them credit where credit's due. It was not possible to build socialism in one isolated country. All of us Marxists would defend with our lives a joint Yugoslav state with a planned economy from the simultaneous attack of local bureaucracy and imperialism, but only as a more favorable starting position for the establishment of a wider Balkan Socialist Federation and further world revolution. This is of course the only way that would prevent the degeneration of the revolution and the creation of a privileged class that would later prove to be the gravedigger of the revolution. Of course, it is our duty to always defend the former Yugoslavia from attacks and slander by nationalist and pro-capitalist forces, but at the same time we must not fall into the trap of making a fetish out of that nation-state, because at the end of the day, Yugoslavia was just that, another nation-state. In truth, that state is an inexpressibly more progressive phenomenon than today's minion semi-colonial states born in the blood of ethnic savagery. When we look at things in this light, the processes that took place at the end of the last century become much clearer. Yugoslav nationalism, that unique, self-governing road to socialism that made us so proud in front of the world, was simply replaced by local national roads to capitalism. For the mentality of local bureaucrats and workers with weaker class consciousness, it was somehow normal to switch gears in a short time and start shouting Serbia or Croatia or whatever instead of Yugoslavia, and feel proud Macedonians and Slovenes instead of Yugoslavs. It has always been somewhat absurd for Albanians, Roma, Romanians, Slovaks, and others to consider themselves Southern Slavs either way. Nonetheless, today, some 30 years later, the Balkanization of the Balkans is still not over. Maybe imperialism would like to quote-unquote stabilize this area at this moment, but it's become too late. Pandora's box has been opened. The fragmentation and bloodshed will not stop until the working class of the Balkans completely breaks away from the pro-capitalist national parties and builds its own party that does not recognize borders. The partisan movement is a huge historical signpost, which cannot be pushed under the carpet and hidden from new generations for a long time. It is inevitable that the working class, with such a rich historical heritage, will rediscover its history and start a new struggle. This time, we have a clear lesson behind us. No to brotherhood and unity. Yes to workers' internationalism. What connects us and puts us on the same side is not Slavic but social origin. In upcoming struggles, we divide people only on the basis of one single parameter, whether they are workers or capitalists. Other details simply do not interest us.